you and your colleagues started the HiTOP model. So what I'm curious about is how that got started broadly, and also what some of those conversations were like with your collaborators.
Yeah. High Top started around 2015, 2016, somewhere in there. A number of people had been kind of publishing on patterns of comorbidity among DSM disorders as kind of a toehold on trying to understand how you might evolve to a different kind of system. And in particular, there are two other people that I need to mention. That's Roman Kotov and David Watson. If you look at the history of High Top, it's fair to say that the three of us were kind of the founders. And really, Roman, in a lot of ways, is the engine behind a lot of this stuff. The person who catalyzed all of this, right, and said, look, different people are kind of publishing on similar ideas. They're sort of doing it within their own lab or work group and coming up with similar and related kind of conceptualizations based on the data. So would it be viable to assemble a consortium, right? Like a group of people who are taking similar approaches with the goal of working on some of these limitations of DSM style approaches in a consortium, right? Like working together, linking a lot of people together. And so, to be honest, my initial reaction to that is it would be hard because of how academics works, right? So there's a lot of herding of cats type of thing that happens in those circumstances. A colleague once told me that, approaches, right, like, or the way you think about the world are kind of like, or models even, right, like are like toothbrushes, right? Everybody's got one, they don't want to use somebody else's. So right, the challenge there, I think, was like, could you get people enough on the same page to see the bigger picture and the advantages of working on this collaboratively, versus working on it more sort of competitively or focusing on somewhat narrow differences among different approaches and conceptualizations to see like the advantages of a big picture and some of the advantages of pulling us all under a rubric, a title, a consortium, a concept. And it's really to Roman's credit, really. Like I wanted to be involved rather than not involved, right? That was clear to me from the beginning because it's exciting and fun to think that such a thing might even be possible. But I got to give a lot of credit to Roman for like doing a lot of the hard work of pulling people together, getting them on the same page, right? He played a pretty substantial role in it, but he was the first author on the very first consortium publication. That's the 2017 HiTOP paper that's often cited as the origin of the approach. And that's been very gratifying, I think is the word I want to use, right? To see that we could do this, right? That there was enough interest among a diversity of colleagues with a diversity of views in trying to get a kind of unified approach together that provides an empirically based alternative to the traditional DSM categorical classification from this kind of grassroots movement, right? So HiTOP's never been connected with or attached to a particular authoritative body, right? So, the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, so has the full weight and financial resources and everything that comes from that kind of connection. Another alternative we might talk about at some point is the RDoC approach. That's an alternative to the DSM that the National Institute of Mental Health has promoted. And I mention it in this context because it's another viable and I think in many ways successful alternative to the DSM, but it's connected with the NIMH. So it has these auspices under which it functions. HiTOP is a grassroots movement by contrast, right? It's academics and many clinicians getting together in a grassroots kind of way to kind of propose an alternative. So does that I think that addresses your question, right? Like where did this all come from, right? It came from that and then it grew from there, right? It turned into a pretty substantial consortium. There's hundreds of members now, many different work groups that are very active on different elements of the kind of intellectual space in which, psychological diagnosis is sitting, right? So there's a genomics work group and neuroscience work group and a clinical applications work group and these kinds of things, right? So it's grown from a few people interested in trying to make it happen to many people wanting to be part of the party, basically, right? And engaged with the endeavor.
Yeah, and I think you very much hit on what I was struck by because there's so much thoughtful infrastructure that you all have put around this. And as an outsider and looking at it all, I'm saying how the hell did these people do this? Not that it's impossible, but that, like, just like you're saying, to an extent, the academic grant getting, like, it doesn't prioritize or sort of reward what you all did. I mean, it seems like, it's rolling a boulder up a mountain. And then when you get to the top of the mountain and starts to go down the other side, then, there might be some benefit in the traditional ways you would think about, because you do have this huge, or sort of this machine theoretically that you can use to build and write grants and papers and do all these other collaborative, wonderful things. But just getting that going without being a part of a pre-existing, reasonably supported organization, I
Yeah,
was just
yeah,
rather like, damn, wow. I would have been the skeptic. I would have been the person who sort of said, yeah, this is a great idea in theory, but the amount of hoops and hurdles and challenges is, we're going to be working on this thing for years before there's any potential benefit, and that, but likely it's going to get cut off before we even get there. And I was just sort of a little bit like, man, that was impressive that they got this thing going and were so successful.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I think maybe part of the reason that was tractable or kind of happened that way is that people were looking for an alternative. In research, right, the DSM is pretty monumentally frustrating to try to work with, because again, like, many presentations don't fit very well. So it's hard, I think, to do research that's constrained by the DSM paradigm. And, there wasn't really, what I want to call this, like a descriptive alternative, right? Like a real target. HiTOP's not perfect or anything, but it does provide a target. Here's an alternative. It has a name. There's these figures in our papers that kind of describe what the alternative looks like based on the existing data that can be, brought to bear on kind of like what would be the outlines of a viable, empirically based alternative. So, like, that, I think that might be part of why that worked the way it did, is because there was a need, and the need is it's right the other way, as you're saying, like, to fulfill a need like that is develop, Krueger's model or whatever, right? And then, like, science is always this dialectic, I think, right? I suspect that historians of science, philosophers of science would back me up on this, between competition and cooperation. Right? There are times when a certain degree of healthy competition can be motivating for a field, because you've got people working within a paradigm to solve certain kinds of problems, trying to be the first to the finish line. But there are other times, and I think many modern areas of scientific inquiry look like this because of the complexity of the problems that are trying to be tackled, where the collaborative approach, right, really is the only. Because it requires leveraging a lot of people and resources and data to come together. So another area that I work in is genetics and genomics, and there that's very clear, right? Those scientific problems are sufficiently complex and multifaceted that it's been much more successful to create consortium type endeavors to make progress, versus thinking that you're going to make some miraculous discovery, working on your own late at night in your lab. Right? It's kind of eureka moment. Has a certain sort of romanticism about it, right? And might play well in the movies, but in reality, it's a lot of hard slogging and collecting a lot of data and working together in larger groups, right, to make real progress. And that's, I think, part of why HiTOP might have worked the way it did, and that people came together, is because it was a viable alternative, and people saw the desirable aspects of trying to cooperate under this umbrella, because there wasn't really like an alternative to the DSM that had a name and a figure, right? And the kind of stuff that's in all those HiTOP publications.